If you take a look at these remaining letters that Paul did not write, basically, look at it, we have two groups they can be put into. One is the church and its suffering. And those would be the letters of James, Hebrews, and 1 Peter, where they end up making their major concern has to do with the suffering church. Probably the reign of Nero had begun, and a lot of issues. Now, except for James, I'm going to disagree with David Suchet here, in that one of the oldest letters we have being, which one did he say it was? 1 Thessalonians, I believe. It is the oldest of Paul's letters. James is probably older. And we'll see that when we look at the book of James. It probably dates back to 45 AD. So it's the first writing we have of the New Testament. And so we look at that. The second part of these last letters would be concerned with the church and the false teaching that was starting to go on. The early stages of all the Gnostic teachings and things that were taking place in the church. So the letters of 2 Peter, Jude, and 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John were addressing those issues. And also, again, laying down groundwork for what the church should look like. Because at this point, they're all beginning to realize the church, Jesus wasn't coming back in their lifetime, and that the church was going to go on. So they had to finish off the job of training the church and training people that could take on from there and keep this going with correct doctrine. Which again, once again, is why we always go back to the apostles' teachings. So that they were the last ones to keep. They wanted to make sure we understood what was really going on as we move forward. So as we look at this, we're going to take a look at the book of James. Now in this, the author of this book, guess who it was? James. He identifies himself as James. He was probably the brother of Jesus and the leader of the Jerusalem Council. Now there are 4 men in the New Testament who have the name James. Now the author of this letter could not have been the Apostle James, because he died in 44 AD. And so he would have already been dead by the date of this letter, which is 45. 2 other men named James neither had the stature nor the influence that this letter would have had. Nobody would have listened to them. So it's got to be the James who is the half-brother of Jesus. Now James was one of several brothers of Christ, probably the oldest, since he's the head of the list in Matthew. If you look at the list, Jesus' brother James is the first one on the list, which you would assume him to be the oldest of the brothers. At first, he did not believe in Jesus. He even challenged him and his mission. But later, he became very prominent in the church. He was one of the select individuals that Christ appeared to after the resurrection. We get that out of 1 Corinthians. Christ appeared to James. So he went to his brother, knowing that he was going to be leading the church in Jerusalem. Paul called him a pillar of the church in Galatians. Paul, on his first post-conversion visit to Jerusalem, one of the people he went to see was James. So James was already, by the time Paul was converted, seen as a leader in the church, which is interesting for not being an apostle, that he so quickly rose to being in a place of leadership in the church. Paul did the same thing on his last visit. Before he left at the end, he visited James again. We get that from Acts 21. When Peter was rescued from prison, he told his friends to go tell James. So here you got Peter and Paul looking to James as one of the leaders that God put in place. And James was a leader, of course, at the Council of Jerusalem. We know that. And interesting, when we get to Jude, we'll see this, that Jude identifies himself simply as a brother of James. Even though he's also a brother of Jesus, he takes his claim as the brother of James. So, and we know that this James was martyred in AD 62. So the date of the writing of this letter, now some have put it in the early 60s, but there are many indications that it was written before 50 AD. And those are, it is very Jewish in its nature, the way it's written. So it suggests that it was composed at a time when the church was predominantly Jewish still. Hadn't had a chance for a huge Gentile influence yet. It reflects a very simple church order. The officers of the church are called elders and teachers. That's it. No overseers, no bishops, none of that, just an elder and a teacher. That's all you have. So it's obviously very early in the structuring of things in the church. Also, what's missing from James is there is no reference to the controversy over Gentile circumcision. And had, the Council of Jerusalem taken place and all this was, the big argument was over Gentile circumcision. None of that, he mentions any of it. So it's all pre that, which would make it pre-50, because that took place in around 50 AD, the Council of Jerusalem. Also, he uses the term synagogue or meeting to designate the meeting and the meeting place of the church. He calls it a synagogue all the time. So again, it really looks like the early dating is correct, because there's just not enough mention of things that happened after 50 AD that you would think James would have talked about had they'd written it down. The only letter that could be older we talked about before was Galatians, if you put that at the early date. But this most likely is the oldest letter, the oldest writing we have of the New Testament. Now, who is he writing to? Well, he explicitly says in 1:1 that he's writing the 12 tribes scattered among the nations. Now, some argue that that expression is referring to the Christians in general. But the term 12 tribes kind of would make you want to say that it was actually writing to Jewish Christians who are now scattered around. And again, the Jewish audience would be more in keeping with how the letter is written, the things he says in it. In fact, in it, he uses the Hebrew title for God. He calls him Lord Almighty, which is a Hebrew term. He uses the Greek words, but it's a Jewish way of referring to God, Lord Almighty, rather than calling him by name or any of those things. Now, it's clearly he was writing to Christians. He wasn't writing to non-Christians. It was for them to understand their faith. It's thought that these were believers who were from the early Jerusalem church who, after Stephen was stoned, many of them scattered out of fear. And they went as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, Syria, Antioch. And so he was writing about, because one of the things he talks about is trials and opposition. James' famous opening is what? Consider it all joy, brothers, when you face trials of various kinds. So they're nervous, they're scared, and he's letting them know, consider it joy. Don't worry about it. It's going to happen. Have a good time. He also has intimate knowledge of the readers, and the authoritative nature of the letter makes us think that, again, James is writing this to these Jewish believers. And again, if he's the leader of the Jerusalem church, he sees all these scattered people from Jerusalem as his congregation. He's acting like a pastor, writing to them and giving them some instructions on how to handle a changing world that's starting to take place, the dispersion of the Jewish people, Jewish believers now. Now, the characteristics of this letter that make it different from other letters, one is its unmistakable Jewish nature. It's very Jewish. Most of us don't read James thinking like that. But if you're reading the Greek and the way it is very Jewish in nature, he is writing to Jews. Two, its emphasis on the vital Christian characterized by good deeds and a faith that works. In other words, just having faith isn't enough to him. You have to have faith that works. You have to go do something with your faith. Good works, in his case, is the term they use. That a genuine faith must and will be accompanied by a consistent lifestyle. It will be seen in your life. Three, it's a simple organization. Four, it's familiar with Jesus' teachings preserved in the Sermon on the Mount. It's very connected to what Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount. And it's very similar to Old Testament wisdom writings such as Proverbs. There's things in it. So next time you look at it, the last part of it, it is an excellent Greek. It's well-written Greek. So James obviously had a good command of Greek. Or his scholar that he had written, his scribe he had writing for him did. Because again, most of these letters were transcribed. They were spoken to a scribe who wrote them down. So, any questions on James, the book of James? The next one is Hebrews. Now this is interesting. Who wrote Hebrews? This letter, the author does not identify himself in this letter. There is no identification of any kind as to who wrote it. But he was obviously well known to those who received the letter, by the way it's written. Just we don't know who it was. Now, for some 1,200 years, from AD 400 to 1600, the book was commonly called the Epistle of Paul to the Hebrews. But there is no agreement in the earlier centuries regarding the authorship. Now, since the Reformation, in the 1600s on, it's been widely recognized that Paul could not have been the author of Hebrews. So it started with not knowing, and after 1600 it went back to we really don't know that it's Paul. Now, there's no disharmony between the teachings of Hebrews and that of Paul's, but the specific emphasis and the writing styles are very different. It just doesn't fit Paul's style. So that's the main argument, that it's just not his style of writing. And contrary to his practice, he identifies himself in every other letter he wrote. So why all of a sudden did he stop identifying himself in one letter? That just doesn't make sense either. And then he has a statement in there, this salvation which was first announced by the Lord was confirmed to us by those who heard him, indicates that the author had not been with Jesus. And Paul was clear in saying that he was visited by Jesus, and he got the message straight from Jesus. So, but the statement made in here is that it was delivered to us by those who had heard him. So it sounds like he's saying, I wasn't one of those who was there. I never actually saw Jesus. And so that's another argument for why it isn't. So when it comes down to it, we don't know who the author of Hebrews is. Okay, but of course we can't leave it there. We're good at guessing if we don't know. Now, the earliest suggestion of authorship is found in Tertullian's writings in around 200 AD, where he quotes from an epistle to the Hebrews under the name of Barnabas. So from the letter, it's clear that Barnabas had some apostolic authority with the church as well. He was an intellectual Hebrew Christian, well-versed in the Old Testament. So Barnabas meets all the requirements of someone who would be writing this. He was a Jew of the priestly tribe of Levi. And again, there's a strong Jewish bent on connecting the Old Testament to what Jesus did in Hebrews. We also know he became a close friend of Paul after his conversion, until they had a splitting of the way later on. And under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, the Church of Antioch commissioned Barnabas and Paul for the work of evangelism, sent them together. So Barnabas is considered one of the possible authors. The other leading candidate for authorship, and this is the one I've always leaned toward for some reason, I can't even give you a good reason, is Apollos. His name was actually first suggested by Martin Luther, and most modern interpreters favor Apollos today as the author. He was an Alexandrian by birth. He was also a Jewish Christian, and with notable intellectual and oratorical abilities. Luke tells us he was a learned man and with a thorough knowledge of the Scriptures. Now we also know that Apollos was associated with Paul in the early years of the church at Corinth. So all you know is every author though has a connection to Paul, hung out with Paul at some point, so I'm sure Paul influenced what they wrote if he didn't write it. And again, it doesn't matter who the actual author is. Another thing that is evident in this is that the author was a master of the Greek language of his day, and was thoroughly acquainted with pre-Christian Greek translation of the Septuagint. All the quotes in Hebrew are from the Septuagint. They're not from the Hebrew Scriptures or from the Greek version of the Hebrew Scriptures. So he was well learned and scholared in the Septuagint. which again, Apollos, being from Alexandria, would have been the only Old Testament scriptures he had. So, when was it written? It had to have been written, all we can give you this, there's no real way to date it outside of it. It had to be written before 70 AD. Because in the discussions in there, he talks about the temple and the priest in the present tense. They're still there. 70 AD, the temple was destroyed. He would have talked in the past tense about what used to happen in the temple. In Hebrews, he's talking about what is still happening in the temple today. So it had to still be there. So all we know is it was before 70 AD that Hebrews was written. And who was he writing it to? The recipients of this letter were Jewish converts who were familiar with the Old Testament, but were being tempted to revert back to Judaism, or someone Judaizing the gospel again. Some have suggested that these professing Jewish Christians were thinking of merging with a Jewish sect, like the ones at Qumran of the Dead Sea Scroll era, that they were going to hook up with them, kind of. They were close in their message and kind of blend them together. And it's also been suggested that it was actually written to a lot of priests who had converted over to Jesus and needed to be straightened out that they were going to have to let go of the Old Covenant. Because the main theme of Hebrews is the supremacy and the sufficiency of Jesus Christ. He is revealed as the mediator of God's grace. In other words, if these were being written to priests who had converted, he was letting them know, you're not the priest anymore with the function you had under the Old Covenant. You have a whole new role now. Jesus becomes the one mediator who intercedes for all of us. It presents Christ as God's full and final revelation, far surpassing the revelation given in the Old Testament. He shows throughout Hebrews how the promises of the Old Testament are all fulfilled in this new covenant, of which Jesus is the mediator. From the Old Testament, Christ is shown to be superior to the ancient prophets, to angels, and the big one, even to Moses. That Jesus is even better than Moses. His covenant is better. It's a better covenant. Because Moses was the mediator of the former covenant. Now Jesus is the mediator of the new one. And Hebrew, another name they have given to Hebrews, it could be called the book of better things. Because that's really what it's all about. We have a better covenant. Everything is improved. That's much better than the old one. The two Greek words for better and superior occur 15 times in the letter. It's constantly that the new covenant is superior to the old, that it's a better covenant, it's superior, it's better, it's superior, it's better. Trying to get it across, don't go back to the old covenant. The new one is a better one. And then another feature of it is the presentation of the gospel is the unique manner in which the author employs expositoring of 8 specific passages of Old Testament scripture. There are in Hebrews actual 8 things that he takes, teaches on them, and shows how Jesus is the fulfillment of those, and it's time to move on and leave the old behind and move on to the new. So it's a fascinating, I love Hebrews. If you've not read through Hebrews, I'd love the book. We'll teach it here at some point again, because it really does, you get to see the improvement of the covenants, the change, and it's quite clear in Hebrews that there is no going back. If you want the old covenant, there's something wrong, because the new is better, it is improved. If the old one had been sufficient, there would have been no need for a new one. So obviously, he's like to the writer here saying, it is obvious that it's got to be better. Because why replace one that was fine? And it wasn't. The old one was powerless in some ways, where the new one has the power to change us. So, good. I wanted to get through those 2 so that we can finish this off next week. I'll get through the last 6. We got six more letters in the book of Revelation. And altogether, you're dealing with only about 25 chapters. Altogether, 20 chapters, and all those letters together. They're all short.